Hey, what's up, Hanger 100 team? Just wanted to share some perspectives from Jolene, and she has been gracious to take the time to answer some questions for us. Her work is primarily trying to figure out how to bring Gen Z and Gen Alpha into the workplace now, into the mission field, and make that transition from maybe a boomer silent generation type and transitioning organizations over to the Gen Z, Gen Alpha as the future that's going to continue these organizations. Would that be a good
Yes. Yeah, great
representation?
summary. Yep.
Okay. And yeah, if you could just introduce kind of your background, I'll let you do that.
Yeah. So I grew up in ministry, but went to college and wanted to work in education and saw a lot of young people graduating from college and really struggling to engage in the workplace. At the time, it was millennials.
Mm.
So that's what really propelled me into this. How do we help the young people that God's raising up really thrive in what God's calling them to? So I've been doing this for over 15 years now, researching and talking about Gen Z and millennials and Gen Alpha now.
Yeah, and so we saw Jolene speak last year, and if you could kind of just share with our group kind of the green and the blue room analogy with the
Yes.
doorway. I thought that was really life changing for me last year when I heard it. I think that's something that definitely needs to be spread. It's a really good analogy.
Yeah, so sometimes it's hard for people to understand why others' experience is so different than their own. So one way I've started to describe that is if you think of a room in which older generations were born where everything was blue.
Hmm.
The expectations were blue, the communication style was blue, the technology was blue, and older generation, silent boomer, Gen X would have been born into this blue room. But then a door opened and
Hmm.
Gen X was next to the door. We kind of saw through the
Yep.
door that there was a green room on the other side and it looked different. The expectations were different. Um, and millennials came along and were born into that green room that was on the other side of the doorway and have experienced life really differently than older generations with technology, globalization, parenting and education trends, lots of changes. Then the door closed, and Gen Z and Gen Alpha were born into a room where all they've known is green. So there's nothing blue in that room, and yet many
Right.
of our organizations, our leadership styles, our educational
Yep.
approaches are still very blue, even though we have a lot of young people who have only experienced a green world. And that's creating a lot of tension as young
Hmm.
people come into organizations today.
Yep. Yeah, and that was really helpful for me because it's really good to have something that you can actually say, okay, this was okay. Now that makes sense. Like,
Yes.
what is this barrier? I don't see the barrier. Can't really explain it. So that's been
Yep.
super helpful. I think you have a book on that.
I don't
Or
talk about
or
that specifically. I do on my podcast.
oh, on the
I talk
podcast.
about,
Okay.
yep. I do have a book that talks about other things, yes,
Okay,
related
that's
to
right.
that.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, just a couple questions we had. So we have a couple different people in our audience. One is a lot of business owners, because Camilo and Tyler, the board members, and I, we do a lot of work in business,
Yep.
as well as ministry. But to the organizational leaders, I guess you could say, whether that's a nonprofit, a church, or an actual business, coming from born in the blue room, raised by the blue room, what are some tips and tricks that you can give for bringing in new talent, and then not just bringing in the new talent, but then keeping that talent in-house still, where they don't feel neglected and they leave?
Yeah. So young people, especially Gen Z, they really want a purpose. So if you have something that's a purpose, that's going to be attractional to them. But really what keeps them is the relationship. There's nothing that is more important than relationship. If they feel like you care about them as an individual, you see the contribution that they individually can make into that purpose that you're building your business around, that is really, really key. And then maintaining a relationship. And often people say, well, that's a lot when we're trying to run a business and
Right.
grow a business. We have things we have to do. I would just encourage people to bring them along with you. So as you're building the business, bring them along into that process. Take them in the car to meet with a client.
That's
Have
good.
them just participate in conversations that you're having. So it's not adding so much work to your life, but it's how do you integrate them into what you're doing. It not only teaches them, but it also helps you maintain that relationship and develop them for future longevity in your company.
Right.
So one of the things we were talking about even before we started recording was how so many young people today are coming from homes where there are not two parents,
Right.
and they're not getting as much adult attention. So often they're coming into organizations really wanting that from bosses and colleagues, just someone who's going to invest in them. And we can do that while we're building a business. So it takes a little more work and intentionality,
Right.
but it can be really powerful.
Okay. And then also kind of a follow-on for that, which I just thought about, is in a very Google Meets, Zoom situation, do you have any examples and practical examples that you've seen that work well for oh, I have a developer that lives in Washington State, but I live in New York, and then I've got my editor who lives in Georgia, and we're all on Zoom. And so have you seen any practical situations where you can bring them along in that?
That's a really good point. I mean, in some instances, it makes it easier because you can invite them into a meeting or a
Right.
conversation without them having to be physically present. So it requires a little more intentionality because you're not there. I do think utilizing those spaces to still develop personal connection becomes really important
Okay.
because we don't just stop in the hallway and chit chat for a few minutes or pop in each other's offices.
Hmm.
And so some of the relational building pieces have to be more intentional in an online environment. So just making
Okay.
sure we're doing that,
So leaving
building that in.
space, not just show up, talk the meeting, and leave kind of
Exactly.
thing. Okay.
Yes. Just making sure, yeah, you're building space to just how are things going, and
Right.
I've seen that happen really powerfully even in virtual spaces where someone's dog is having surgery and
Yeah.
everyone's asking about it and
Yeah.
sending cards and well wishes or whatever, even just silly things
Yeah.
that might be small, but it helps build that relational connection.
Okay. And then kind of my last question on the business organizational side that I found helpful. I don't know if this is more just within millennials, but I've started using the voice memos. Is that
Yes. Yes.
Do Gen Z and Alpha like that as well? Because then they can hear the intonation in your voice, they can
Hmm.
hear your voice, and it gives more context, I feel like.
Yes. I mean, I think some of it's personality driven,
Mhm.
as well as generational. What some people, an auditory learner, would probably appreciate that
Okay.
more than someone who maybe is more of a visual processor. But asking them, I think, is really helpful. Hey, do you prefer this format of message or the other format? Because it is helpful when you can, yeah, hear voice or
Yeah.
see facial expressions.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's really helpful. And yeah, this has been very impactful for me. She just did a talk that was an hour and a half, and everybody in the room was sucked in the whole time. So I appreciate
Yeah.
how you organize the thoughts and
Mhm.
communicate this. And then, so to our Gen Z and Alphas,
Mm.
for those watching that are in that category, one of the things you mentioned at the end is it takes a lot of faith on their part, or within faith, they ask the question, um, well, why can't we do that?
Mhm.
And maybe the older generation is this, well, we just can't do that,
Mhm.
with really no
Yeah.
explanation and stuff. So I think courage is the word that
Yeah.
came to mind while you were talking about
Yeah.
that earlier, on both sides, but really for the Alpha and Z
Mhm.
generation, because they're really the ones that are going to have to kind of really fight for that.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
what are kind of your thoughts around that for specifically an Gen Alpha and Gen
Yeah.
Z?
We live in a world where everything is instantaneous today. That's just the reality, is so many things are instantaneous. And so I would just encourage all of us to remember that the strongest, best things often take a really long time. You think of a really strong tree. It takes a long time for that tree to put down strong roots and develop, but it is hard to move it once it has grown to
Right.
full maturity. And so to just recognize that sometimes the very best things are going to take time and energy and patience and advocating. But that doesn't mean that they're not important or that we should give up on them.
Right.
Um, Everything that in the world you look throughout history that has had great meaning has usually taken time and energy. So don't give up. Have patience. It builds strength to wait for things. And so just embrace that process and don't give up on the things that are really worth building over time.
Nice. And then is there any kind of communication style or saying or something that you've seen that kind of allows a Gen Z or Alpha to kind of, when they're speaking and they use this technique, all of a sudden the boomers are like, oh, that makes sense.
Mm,
Are there any?
that's a
I
good
think we're still
question.
trying to figure it out,
Yes, we
right?
are, but I will say respect goes a really long ways.
Mm, yeah.
So notice how even the people that you're working with speak to one another respectfully, because how people communicate is often what they value.
Mm,
And so it might be different from person to person, But if someone listen, be respectful, listen to people's ideas, ask really thoughtful questions is really important too because it shows you care and you're interested. Listen more than you talk is always a good
Yeah.
strategy for every generation.
Yeah, it goes back to the Bible, right?
It
Something like
does,
that,
yes,
yeah.
it does. So just be sure that you're being a really good listener, you're listening respectfully, and that often gives us a voice then to give input.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so then to transition to kind of my last question for the millennials, and really Xers as well,
Mm-hmm.
kind of that
Mm-hmm.
both those groups, really kind of being the translators.
Yes.
I
Yes.
remember what it was like without phones. Now I have a smartphone, right?
Yes. Yes.
Um, what do you think is if somebody's looking to impact this effort to kind of bridge the gap?
Mm-hmm.
What is one of those areas that they could serve the best in to
Mm-hmm.
bridge the gap between the silent generation of boomers and Gen Alpha and Gen Z
Mm-hmm.
that you've seen?
Yeah. It is. We are bridge generations, and the people who find themselves in those bridge roles, it requires a lot of self sacrifice because what you find yourself always doing is advocating for others. So you're advocating for Gen Z and Alpha to older leaders. You're advocating for the perspectives and experiences of older leaders to younger generations. And it does require an element of self-sacrifice to not represent your own needs, to but
Right.
continually represent the needs of others. And really, I don't think you need to be in a specific position to find yourself doing that.
Mhm.
Most of us have many
Yeah.
opportunities around us every day. So just embrace being the bridge builder. God says, blessed are the peacemakers. And I
Mm.
really feel like there's a blessing for those who are bringing peace in the midst of intergenerational miscommunication and misunderstanding sometimes. And that's often millennials and Gen Xers. So, yeah.
Yeah, I really like that. That's very
Mm-hmm.
good. Because sometimes it feels like you're just beating your head against the wall a
It
little
does.
bit, and you're
Yes, it
like, oh,
does.
can't you see the way they see, and can't you
Yes.
see the way that they see,
Mm-hmm.
and that's
Yeah.
why I really enjoyed the analogy that you did with the
Mm-hmm.
rooms and stuff like
Yeah.
that. So,
Yeah.
thanks, Jolene, for
Yes. Thank you,
hanging out and
Scott.
taking the time.
Yes.
I know it's been you drove up and
Yes. It's great to be here.
working a
Good to
lot.
talk to everyone.
And yeah, if you guys have any questions, where if they want to find out more, you said
Mm-hmm.
you mentioned a podcast. Where can any of the generations that are looking to get more involved with this and really trying to hone their skills,
Yeah.
where can they find you and get involved with
Mm-hmm.
your ministry?
Yeah, so my website's leadingtomorrow.org, just one word, Leading Tomorrow, and my podcast is the Leading Tomorrow podcast. So
Okay,
pretty straightforward, yeah.
great, great. Well, thanks so much, everybody, and we'll link all that below, as you say on social media these days. And we'll see you guys next time.